The U.S. Department of Justice released the psychological profile for Jeffrey Epstein, and we're going to go through this in detail. You can see he was an inmate at the time when they were doing these analyses, and he actually died, and we got this after the date of the death. So we want to go through this and see exactly who is drafting it, where it's going. It is from the Assistant Director of Reentry Services, memo for the Regional Director of the Northeast Region out of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This is in D.C., dated September 17, 2019, after Epstein died. This is the psychological reconstruction of the inmate death. This is an interim report because we're still gathering all of the rest of the necessary data. They tell us formal interviews were not conducted as part of this reconstruction to avoid interference with other pending investigations. A copy of the video is normally made by special investigative staff following an incident like this, but there was no such video in this case since the original video was confiscated by the FBI prior to the beginning of this reconstruction. Wonder what they wanted that for. The absence of these two sources of information severely limited the ability to establish accurate timelines, confirm subjective reports, establish converging and diverging lines of facts, and discover new areas of inquiry. As a result, information typically gathered, reviewed, and consolidated during a reconstruction to support actionable findings and recommendations is limited. So it's very curious. It seems like we might want that FBI data in order to create an accurate report with accurate timelines to confirm the subjective reports and other details, but the FBI has not given it to these people who are writing this document. This was prepared by this person's name, which has been redacted, the National Suicide Prevention Coordinator over from the Psychology Services branch. And this is just CYA language saying, I'm going to give you my best take on this, but I'm missing major portions of what I need to do my job. As background, they say Epstein, 66-year-old white male, died August 10th while housed in the jail. Many people were acting directors and involved to create this psychological reconstruction. The team was so-and-so and so-and-so redacted and so-and-so redacted and so-and-so. All of these people working with the agencies. They say that Mr. Epstein did not have a pre-sentence report available at the time of the reconstruction. And a pre-sentence report is exactly what it sounds like. When a defendant is convicted and awaiting sentencing, you go through the trial, you go through a guilty plea, you go through proceedings, and there is a break in time between when a person is actually convicted and they are sentenced. And in that window of time, different people prepare reports. The defense is going to prepare a report to argue for a minimum sentence. Yes, he was convicted, but here's why the penalty should be minimum. The prosecutors are going to argue for the maximum and submit their own report as to why, saying this justifies upward departures and so on. And then we have the PSR, which is typically drafted by an independent agency like a probation department, and they do their own assessment. So when you write analyses, you might want to refer to that because it's more or less supposed to be this neutral person who is not the defense, not the prosecutor, who's given the judge their independent take. So they would like to look at it, but that was not available for this either. So we're missing even more history. There's no official information regarding the social history about Epstein. They got the following from public documents. Epstein was born in 1953, grew up middle-class family, Seagate on Coney Island, Brooklyn, one brother. After early promotion in 2 grades, Epstein graduated Lafayette High School, 69, age 16. He attended Cooper Union, New York University, but did not graduate from either. He taught at the Dalton School, a private school, Upper East Side, Manhattan, from 1974 until he was dismissed June 1976. Why? Inadequate development as a teacher. Following that, he held a number of positions in the financial industry, to include a position as a limited partner at Bear Stearns until he was dismissed for other policy violations. Worked as a financial consultant, founded 2 separate companies. They tell us Mr. Epstein had 2 significant periods of employment. First was a position as a consultant with Redacted, and another described as blank. This person was described as his first mentor. Blank was later convicted for running a large Ponzi scheme. He implicated Mr. Epstein in fraudulently diverting company funds for his own personal use. Later, blank, Mr. Epstein's sole client at J. Epstein and Company, granted him power of attorney over his affairs. Despite also being identified as blank mentee, Mr. Epstein was again accused of misappropriating funds, more than $46 million. These large sums are believed to be seed money that Epstein used to establish his considerable fortune. The events are indicative of Mr. Epstein's highly regarded intelligence and charismatic personality. They say Mr. Epstein had a history of adult criminal charges. In June 2008, he entered a non-prosecution agreement, one of the most insane agreements ever, that basically immunized him and everybody that he ever knew from further prosecution. And the fact that he was being prosecuted again, and the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell was being prosecuted again, in my opinion, at least implicated this plea deal. In other words, his plea deal was so big and so massive and so gratuitous, you could make the argument, it wasn't successful, that it immunized Ghislaine Maxwell from prosecution. Or maybe not her because she was so close to it, but they didn't go after anybody else. It was just Epstein and Ghislaine. Even though many people like Gates and Reid Hoffman and many others were flying around with him going to his island after he had already pled guilty in June 2008. Pleaded guilty to 1 count of prostitution and procuring a minor in the state of Florida for those purposes. 30 months sentence, 18, which is crazy, 30 months sentence, 18 months of incarceration, and 12 months probation. Mandatory registered offender. People still hung out with him after that date. The same people who still scream and shout that they're big advocates for the victims of abuse. Epstein served 13 of his 18-month incarceration and then successfully completed 12 months of probation. Unclear whether he followed the offender registration guidelines when he owned a residence. Of course not. He probably was still doing everything. In regard to the pending charges, Epstein was formally charged with other conspiracies in violation of U.S. code. Accused of exploiting and abusing minors over the course of several years, documents allege that Epstein enticed and recruited minor females to engage in activity. The minor females were reportedly compensated with cash following the encounters. He pleaded not guilty to these charges and was on pretrial status. In a 37-page decision signed by Judge Berman, 18 pages were dedicated to detailing the danger that Epstein posed to others in the community. Documents said he's a flight risk. As a result, his bail package was inadequate, and he was denied release. There was some institutional history. On July 6, Epstein was arrested at the airport coming back from France. Unknown whether he was anticipating his arrest. Keyed into Sentry, was in the general population for a period of time. As he adjusted to his correctional setting, he received one incident report of self-mutilation. The report had been expunged, though it was unclear why it had been expunged and whether Mr. Epstein knew this. As of August 2015, the incident was removed. So July, he mutilated himself. Somebody deleted the record, purged it August 15th. A review of financial transactions associated with Epstein's prison account revealed one of his attorneys was depositing funds into his commissary for unknown reasons. They say that Epstein had some medical conditions, hyperlipidemia, sleep apnea, hypertension, constipation, prediabetes, neuritis, and other things. Was on different medications, docusate sodium, milk of magnesia, omega-3s, methylprednisone, and Biscadil. Mr. Epstein was also prescribed insulin, and the prescription required him to go to the institution pharmacy for administration. However, the dates for which it was prescribed have a notation as dose not indicated, so it doesn't appear that it was medically necessary. He also came in with his personal CPAP machine, which is what he slept with. In regard to mental health history, no known available records. Any records that were maintained relating to his incarceration in Florida were not available. Forensic psychologists completed a routine intake screening. Epstein denied any history of mental health, any substance abuse and treatment. No symptoms were observed, not diagnosed with mental illness. Following a consultation with suicide, they say he should be preemptively evaluated for suicide risk. High risk factors for suicide based on the fact it's got a high profile case, pending bad charges, pre-trial detention status. They say he denied suicidal thoughts at the time, but due to the potential for other risk factors listed above, the on-call psychologist placed him on observation and watch cells where he could be monitored. Less restrictive than suicide watch. Psychological observation is one less serious. Used for inmates who were stabilizing and to transition people off suicide watch. On July 9th, Mr. Epstein underwent a formal in-person suicide risk with so-and-so. She determined that while suicide watch was not warranted, Mr. Epstein should remain on a psychological observation just out of an abundance of caution. He was removed from psychological observation on July 10th. Here we get this redacted, big paragraph redacted. He was placed back on suicide watch at 1:40 a.m. We don't know what happened here. Removed from psychological observation on this time, and then something. Then he was placed back on suicide watch at 1:40 a.m. pending an in-person suicide risk assessment. So kind of important what happened here, because he was off and then back on. Staff psychologist assessed the risk for suicide later in the morning of July 23rd and determined, yeah, he should remain on suicide watch because so-and-so. Now, after 31 hours, he was removed from suicide watch on July 24th. Thereafter, he was on watch until in his cell, in the watch cell, and placed on psychological observation, where he remained housed until July 30th, 2019. His cell assignment indicates that he was transferred back to a special housing unit. Now, this is where a discrepancy exists regarding when he was removed. Two different dates. Special housing unit, they say July 29th he was removed, transferred back to SHU, whereas PDS-BEMR says he was removed at July 30th, so a day later. Epstein attended court July 31st, and upon his return, staff noted suicide tendencies, notified other people. Somebody else met with him to conduct a risk assessment and determine suicide watch not warranted. Remained classified as level 1. There was evidence, though, Mr. Epstein was experiencing challenges. He reported frequent complaints of difficulty sleeping, did not have access to a CPAP machine, bothered by noise, noted safety concerns. Others described him as a coward. He described himself as a coward and someone who does not like pain. He told so-and-so the toilet in his cell would not stop flushing. He took to sitting in the corner with his hands over his ears. Mr. Epstein indicated he was agitated following the incident. He was unable to sleep that night. Now, this is the background. They say that Epstein entered the Bureau of Prisons July 6, history of convictions, release denied. They tell us that after 31 hours on suicide watch, he was placed on psychological observation, later removed, sent an email, someone sent an email reporting Epstein had been removed from psychological observation and needed to be housed with an appropriate cellmate. 27 members had opened the messages as of August 13th. A federal court also unsealed 2,000 pages of documents that included graphic allegations against Mr. Epstein. High-profile figures like Virginia Giuffre, Ghislaine Maxwell are all alleged to have assisted with his criminal activities. Mr. Epstein was afforded telephone calls on 2 different days, although it's unknown whether they were legal or social calls. No recording of the calls exists. Not known with whom he was speaking. It's amazing. Just amazing. I mean, he gets special calls. One occurred on or around July 16th, the other August 9th. Legal calls are not monitored and would not be recorded. Yeah, right, but they would be logged generally and noted as such. This is a legal call with his lawyer. A social call would be recorded. Given the limited information about Mr. Epstein, knowledge of the content of any social calls would have been crucial in helping staff with him. Yeah. Following his final telephone call on the evening of August 9th, Epstein was moved back into his regular cell. He was single-celled at the time because his cellmate, Efren Reyes, did not return from court. The need for a cellmate was communicated between day watch, but no cellmate was placed with him. According to a memo by a senior specialist, staff were informed that Mr. Epstein's cellmate would not return from court. Further, Officer so-and-so noted Mr. Epstein would need a cellmate upon arrival from court. A review of the 30-minute rounds form indicate that the rounds were completed for the entire shift. However, a memo from Lieutenant so-and-so indicates that Officer Blank and Material Handler Supervisor Blank made a statement after Epstein's death that they did not complete proper 30-minute rounds at 3 a.m. or 5 a.m. They didn't do their jobs. A detailed description of the scene was unavailable because officers who discovered Mr. Epstein did not write memos and could not be interviewed. Why not? According to the report of the incident, on August 10th at approximately 6:33 a.m., while serving the breakfast meal, Mr. Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell. Staff reportedly called for medical assistance, activated the blank, and began life-saving measures. Arriving staff stated they brought an automated external defibrillator and a stretcher. Cardiopulmonary CPR was continued. No shock. Advised CPR continued. Mr. Epstein was escorted to health services 6:39. Arrived 6:43, transported to the hospital 7:10. Epstein pronounced dead 7:36. It was not possible to confirm this timeline without viewing video footage. So in their conclusions and recommendations, they say a general appreciation of risk factors for suicide specific to sex offenders is necessary when reviewing Epstein's death. These factors, as well as more general risk factors for this, were likely present. Common factors include history of abuses. These include stigma due to the nature of the crimes, disruption of the ability to utilize sex as a coping mechanism. Grief may be secondary to the former loss of a former lifestyle, loss of the physical items, the collections related to the offenses, loss of the perceived relationships, all cause increased likelihood of death. He was high-profile pretrial detainee on these types of charges. He had been successful, wealthy, and a number of high-profile acquaintances, including charisma, charm, and intelligence. He had significant deep or interpersonal ties. Although Mr. Epstein appeared to cultivate large and professional networks, he estranged from his only brother. His identity appeared to be based on his wealth, power, and associations with other high-profile individuals. And so blank redacted, can't see what that is. In the weeks before his death, he made statements that he was a coward, had difficulty sleeping. He also frequently referenced poor sleep and inability to tolerate the noise. On the day before his death, a number of documents in his case were unsealed, further eroding his elevated status and implicating some of his associates. The lack of significant connections, a complete loss of his status, and the thought of spending his life in prison were likely factors that contributed to Mr. Epstein's death. So that is the summary and the background on Epstein, and you can see a lot of the rest of this is details that fill in the blanks about the specifics, about the follow-up, the phone calls, and about how he was denied bail, along with other specific recommendations and analysis. But examined a bunch of documents. You can see a lot of it was here. True intel, true view, staff email, photographs of the scene, autopsy, post orders, lieutenant logs, attorney logs, staff rosters, timelines, autopsy reports, court record, all the things, but not all of it. There was a lot that they were not able to see and a lot of mistakes that allegedly happened. And Epstein, they tell us, is dead.